The masons at Carnarvon were working on something that hadn't been seen on these shores before. Edward I's new fortresses had a colonial town built into them. These were known as bastides, an idea taken from Gascony. For Wales, he built the most heavily fortified version possible. Bastides were a truly colonial idea. They were surrounded by high walls and laid out on a military-style grid system. They were designed to provide both goods and taxes, and were even subject to their own colonial laws. Bastides were a way of generating income for the project. But in Wales, the king's new bastide towns had a far more sinister side. The Welsh were cut out, and the English filled the townships.
It was clear, I think, that the building of these new towns represents a process of deliberate Anglicisation of North Wales, bringing in new towns, which the Welsh are totally unaccustomed to, and bringing in new settlers from England.
These civilian settlements formed part of a classic frontier land, hostile territory peopled by a defeated enemy. The last castle Edward built in Wales would be Beaumaris, meaning beautiful marsh. Standing on the island of Anglesey, it was intended to be the crowning glory of the Iron Ring and the finest work of his master mason, James of St. George. Beaumaris was a military masterpiece, planned with an almost impenetrable series of defences. It was based around the idea of concentric walls, essentially building a castle within a castle. Like so much else, it was a lesson learnt from the great fortresses of the Holy Land. If you were an attacker and you managed to make it through or over this wall, you'd then be trapped here in a killing zone. You'd face a constant barrage of missiles, and you still had to make it past this even bigger wall. If you were a defender, you could mount a solid defence of the outer walls, firing over the moat, while constantly being protected by covering fire from your comrades here up on the inner wall. But if that outer wall was then breached, you could retreat here. Every time the attackers were slowed down by a new line of defences, whether it was the moat, the outer wall, or the inner wall, they were exposed. James of St. George was now known as the master of the king's works in Wales, and Beaumaris offered him something unique. Unlike all of the other castles in the Ring of Iron, Beaumaris was built on an entirely new site. It was a blank canvas, and it allowed Master James to build exactly the castle that he wanted. The flat marshland terrain allowed him to build an almost perfectly symmetrical fortress with no compromises in form. More than 2,500 people were brought in to work on this project in the first year alone. But there was a problem. Castles were enormously expensive, and Edward's brutal wars had almost bankrupted the kingdom. For all its design genius, Beaumaris was never actually finished.